timing. Alba,
Hi.
from Runnymede Trust.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Martin, for that. I found what you said so sort of profoundly worrying. Unfortunately, not hugely shocking insofar as we know that this is the situation on the ground, and we've been watching the sort of this discourse turn into where it is. But I just really appreciate the way that you set out the work that you do. And I am here from the Runnymede Trust, and we are an organisation that works on issues of racial justice, and we advocate for people of colour across the UK. And so what I'm going to try and do in about 10 minutes is talk a bit about the links between hostile discourse around migration and their racialized implications. So why it is and how we must think about this anti-migration rhetoric, this anti-migration politics, and the politics around asylum seekers that Martin just talked about as racist and as racialized in their outcomes. And I wanted to talk about that in relation to a recent report that we have done called Creating the Crisis by two academics that I will share in the chat. Which also explains some more about how we're thinking about immigration as a sort of manufactured crisis in the run-up to the 2024 general election. So I wanted to start by talking about how successfully migration and race have been delinked in our public discourse. So we do not see the migration politics and policies that are being pushed forward by politicians in power and across the political spectrum as having racialized outcomes. We are told that they are examples of neutral policymaking in this regard. So when leading politicians refer to the so-called hurricane of migrants or advocate for tighter controls and more inhumane policymaking around migration, they can claim that this is in fact nothing to do with race. But what we know is that political debate historically and in the present day have traded on racialized ideas of who is welcome and who doesn't belong. So migration policy and the way that we think about immigration in this country is predicated on the exclusion of people of colour. So if we think about that historically and with a historical lens, we might look to the sort of Commonwealth Immigration Act of 1962, an act which privileged white Commonwealth migrants over their counterparts of colour from colonised countries. And this act, when it was being passed in 1962, the then Home Secretary described it as having a great merit as a piece of legislation, insofar that it appears neutral and it is presented, and I quote, as making no distinction on grounds of race and colour, but its impact was fully intended to be racialized. So its impact was about privileging white Commonwealth immigrants over people of colour. And if we fast forward to the 21st century, we can see the continuation of this legacy. We are told that policymaking around migration is neutral in nature and to forget about its racialized implications. But what we know and what the Runnymede Trust is really clear about in our work is that hostile policies on migration are racist. They condemn migrants from particular countries, often in the global south and former colonies, to inhumane treatment, and they are racialized in their outcomes. And I mean, we don't really need examples after hearing what Martin was speaking about in the situation in Suffolk and who it was that was most affected by these inhumane policies. But if we think about the way that hostile environment policies have been enacted over the last 10 years, we can see some really critical ways in which they have racialized impacts. The right to rent policy was found to be discriminatory by the High Court on the basis that it enabled indirect discrimination of people of colour by asking them to have a burden of proof to prove their citizenship rights to access housing. The same with the NHS surcharge, which looked to ask people of colour to have a burden of proof to prove their access to critical social services. And who was it that suffered? It was people of colour, migrants of colour, and of course, as the Windrush scandal taught us, it was Black Britons. Black Britons who still today, years after the scandal first hit and was reported on, have not had access to the compensation that they deserve and are entitled to. I'm sure we all saw the sort of shocking statistics that came out last year that showed that only 1 in 4 of the 6,348 applications submitted received payments from the government. So still, we see the ongoing racialized implications of this policy, which impacted settled Black and ethnic minority people, Black and ethnic minority people from the Windrush generation, Black Britons in particular, and who still have not had access to justice. We've really got to understand the connection between race and migration in understanding the way that the Windrush compensation scheme has unfolded. And of course, these policies are today still not neutral in intent or reality. The government's devastating Rwanda plans are, of course, centred on an inhumane treatment of asylum seekers of colour. I mean, the inhumanity in the rollout of this plan, given the comments yesterday, I don't need to persuade you of, but I think it's important to reflect on the way that they are always coupled with warnings about, and I quote, the so-called hurricane or invasion of refugees and migrants, and reflections also on the failures of multiculturalism, condemning Britain's so-called immigration dependency. The messaging around the Rwanda plan too, and indeed the new immigration legislation coming through, is always based on euphemisms that are there to stoke racial tensions. And at home too, if we look to the shocking asylum seeker accommodations and the use of large-scale accommodations, the barracks, Penally and Napier barracks as examples, and of course the hotels that Martin spoke about earlier as well, we know that what they do is they segregate asylum seekers who are largely of colour from surrounding majority white populations. These sites as well, by denying the ability for asylum seekers to integrate with the majority white populations that they are secluded from in detention-like conditions, inhumane conditions, also have become targets for far-right groups who racially harass asylum seekers living in these accommodations. So it's really critical that we use this lens in understanding hostile migration policies and their impact, and we don't forget that in the run-up to the 2024 general election. And our report on this, our research on this, written by 2 academics who I mentioned earlier, highlights the way in which immigration in this case has too been constructed as an issue of public concern. So these racialized policies, hostile migration policies, have always been communicated to us, to their audience, as a result of the will of the people. So I don't know if we saw the sort of popcorn event that took place earlier today. I don't know if anyone else had the misfortune of seeing that. But one of the things that was immediately done was to invoke the will of the people in sort of making these reactionary policies. So thinking about the Rwanda policy as a product of a silent majority, or I think Liz Truss referred to secret conservatives in justifying this inhumane policymaking. So what we're trying to communicate in our work is how political and media elites operate interactively and play a crucial part in the construction of immigration as a public concern. So by invoking the people's will and the mainstream in pushing forward these inhumane policies, we are told that they cannot be doubted and are inherently justified. So we are given always the politics of representation here. We are told that because ministers of colour are pushing forward these inhumane, hostile migration policies, they cannot be racist, they cannot be anti-migrant, and they are the will of the people. Well, we have to combat that. We have to talk about the ways in which they have racialized implications. We have to talk about the ways in which anti-migration rhetoric is based on the othering of communities and people of colour in particular. And that is what Runnymede Trust is aiming to do in the upcoming general election, and to think carefully about how we can communicate the important connections between race and migration. And I'm very keen to engage with everyone here on that work and as it unfolds, and to really talk about the role of this hostile immigration rhetoric in pushing forward the ideas around far-right populism and the invoking of the will of the people as well. So I'm going to leave that there, and I'm very open to any questions in our work or research.
Thank you very much, Alba. And the will of the people, it's very chilling, that, very chilling.